Good morning. So when Mark invited me to preach on this Sunday where we celebrate the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and thank you so much for that invitation, Mark. It's always an honor to be invited to teach or preach in this space. And when he told me the question was, what does it mean to be a community of prophecy? I knew right away I wanted to preach from Jeremiah, a book of promises, images of oil and wine and joy and dancing. But Mark's invitation came on November 3rd. So in case there's any confusion, November 3rd comes before November 8th. I take it you know what happened on November 8th. So I'll tell you what prophecy doesn't mean. It doesn't mean being able to predict the future. If it did, when that November 3rd invitation came, I probably would have said, thank you, Mark, but no. Because how do you preach on this day, a day when we remember not just a man, but a movement of Black people who changed this nation forever, when we honor everyday working class women and children and men who risked their lives, literally stood up during a reign of racial terror and said, we will be free? How do you preach on a day that honors that sacred story? The very same week that someone who was deemed too much of a white supremacist to be appointed to a federal court back in the 80s, and that was hard to do in the 80s, sat in Congress for confirmation hearings to now the most powerful legal position in the land. Thank you, Mark, but no thanks. But prophecy is not about predicting the future, and so here we are. And there couldn't actually be a more urgent time to ask the question, what does it mean to be a community of prophecy? Because Ish is about to get real. And so I'm still going to turn to Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a Hebrew prophet, a prophet who no doubt had dark skin, and who lived as a people in political and social crisis, even though this people knew who they were deeply in their bones. And this people was contending with an unexpected change in fortune. They had gone quickly from the relative peace, security, and predictability of political life as a kingdom, Israel, to life now lived at the whim of a violent, unpredictable, warmongering set of leaders who had conquered Israel and sent their people into exile. So there might still be something in this story for us today. How many of you have a Facebook feed? So when I sat down to read Jeremiah after November 8th, it sort of gave me Facebook whiplash. There's a God who talks through Jeremiah about a people who have survived terror and swords and violence, but are experiencing grace. And there's a people for whom in that very moment God still feels devastatingly absent, and yet immediately God appears and says, I've loved you with an everlasting love, and I've never ceased to be faithful to you. And there's angry clarity in Jeremiah that these people, Israel, have been conquered and scattered into exile because they had broken promises. And then immediately God talks about gathering them in as a shepherd gathers a flock, with a promise that a new day of peace and flourishing will come. It's just like Facebook. News about the election being hacked, the next vile thing Trump has said about people of color and immigrants and women and people with disabilities, sinister behavior of our Senate going till 1 a.m. to deny people, working people, health care access, and then, ooh, look, a kitten. Right? Books of prophecy like Jeremiah almost always create spiritual and emotional and psychological whiplash. And it kind of makes sense because you actually don't need prophetic speech when things are good. Prophets show up when injustice and violations of community and the degradation of human life have become so normal that a people's fate is in peril. But when prophets show up, they also always bring relentless promises. The promise of peace, the promise of flourishing. If there's a recommitment to justice, to love, to courage, to nurturing life, to the work, the hard work of creating conditions in which we can all thrive. But the whiplash is the very hard part about prophecy because you don't get to recommit until you first get really honest about where you're actually at. You don't get to beautiful future unless you contend fiercely with the ugly of the now. And that's also why prophets almost always end up in trouble, because they talk about where we're actually at, and they put their bodies on the line to challenge the actually where we're at. And so we could actually just leave the sermon right there today, because that's the basic story of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He lived all of that. He knew all of that. He preached and spoke it daily. When he said things like, no one is free if others are oppressed, he meant if any of us are going to really get free, we have to see, name, call out, resist oppression, period, no questions asked. And that's the story of, yes, let's say his name from a pulpit this morning, John Lewis, 45 times arrested in the civil rights movement, beaten within an inch of his life because he was naming the ugly and fighting it and had a relentless commitment to a promise of a peaceful, just future. So we should be saying his name. Recommit to justice now for a just, peaceful future. We could leave the sermon right there. But we're not going to. Because knowing we have to fight for justice, for peace tomorrow, is head knowledge. And my sense is in this moment, we all need some deep heart knowledge, because we're feeling a little like blue. So what does it mean to be a community of prophecy? Whenever I preach, I ask questions of the sacred texts I use. Questions like, can this text tell our story? If so, how? How does it tell our story? Could we tell our story through it? What would that look like? When I sat down to ask these questions of Jeremiah today, it got dicey for me very quickly. First of all, there's all this stuff in Jeremiah about God giving a special promise to chosen people. And I know I don't have to tell you how dangerous that is, right? Chosenness got us all here in the first place. Chosenness was the way that newly white American people told the story of our right to dispossess native peoples of their land and enslave African peoples to create this chosen exceptional nation. Chosenness hovers all through that phrase, make America great again. Is that the story? Yeah, but. And then the whole book of Jeremiah, like so many of our ancient texts, uses women over and over, uses women's bodies, violently sometimes, as metaphor, but violent nonetheless, used thus making objects of women. And I know we recognize that story. And then I remembered being in a car this last October on my way to Flint, Michigan, where they have no water still. And I was riding with a powerful African-American minister, the Reverend Dr. Renee Jackson. And we started talking about the violence unleashed by Trump's campaign, and Dr. Jackson said, I just wonder, what must the world be thinking of about us right now? And then she went on to talk about Jeremiah, and about how Israel in Jeremiah gets exposed and put on display, quote, for all the nations to see, the book says. And she's being exposed, Israel's being exposed, see, Jeremiah uses she. Israel's being exposed and put on display, her evil and her sin for all the nations to see, in and of itself as a kind of judgment on all that evil that Israel has allowed to persist in its nation. And then Dr. Jackson went on to say aloud, so I kind of wonder if there's some parallels here, and maybe we're underneath some judgment. Is that our story? So I was getting knocked around by this text. We've all been knocked around a lot the last 2 months. But then I came upon this image that I could not let go of and which has claimed me in return. In the part we read today, Jeremiah is talking about Israel, and while he talks about this, unveils this lush promise of God calling people back, grief into joy, women dancing, we suddenly hear a voice in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel's weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted because they are no more. Rachel's children have been swept away into exile. They're gone. And Rachel refuses to be consoled about this. Even when God comes and says, don't worry, Rachel, we never hear that she's consoled. She refuses to be consoled. And all of a sudden, when I saw Rachel, I found my ground. And this prophetic text stopped knocking me around quite so much because I could see her, Rachel, a dark-skinned Hebrew mother refusing to be consoled. Rachel, in a state of lament. And I remembered that one of my most important mentors, Reverend Dr. Emily Towns, who's a brilliant womanist ethicist, she wrote some years ago that we are a people in search of paradise, living in a world of theme parks. And Towns says, if we want to find paradise, we have to start where we are, and we must go through lament. Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of hate lament. I want to run from lament because it's painful, and it means naming losses so deep they usually defy words. And I know how I felt November 9th, and I'd rather forget that feeling for sure, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be back this weekend. But Towns is very clear that lament is key, because lament is the truthful, truth-filled, and truth-telling we need. Otherwise, we'll confuse paradise for a theme park. So I want to give you an example. Last spring, after having President's Day off and after clearly having studied presidents at school, my 7-year-old at the time, Harper, was running around talking about George Washington. George Washington this and George Washington that, and it was kind of driving me crazy, actually. Till finally one morning, a story came on the radio about a politician who'd done something wrong, one of those NPR moments in the kitchen. And Harper overheard it, and she said, what's that about, Mama? What's going on? And I said, well, this politician's in trouble because he did something wrong. And she goes, is he an adult? And I said, well, yeah. And she looked at me kind of shocked, and I said, actually, lots of adults, and occasionally a few politicians do some wrong things. They do, she said. It's getting salacious for her, like what? And I said, here it is. Here's the moment. You know how you've been running around here talking about George Washington, loving him up? She said, yeah. Honey, George Washington enslaved African American people. And she looked at me with horror. He did? Yeah, he did. And here's the part that took my breath away. She said, Mama, why? Not why did he do that? Here was her why. Why does my school talk about him as if he is such a great man? Now, just a side note, appropriate on King's Sunday, that kind of moment right there we need to learn to recognize because it's where white racialization happens young. That's a side note. Push away the lament. In Towns' terms, my daughter's school, so amazing in a bazillion ways, had offered her a theme park. And so my daughter and I sat down and we lamented together. We lamented George Washington's actions, and then we lamented that her beloved, amazing school had let her consume a not truthful truth, but a lie. And then we talked about what happens if we don't tell the whole truth about our own story. Because we don't only lie when we lie. We also cease to feel because we're refusing lament. And so we lose part of our humanity. And here's the thing about Jeremiah. This whole book is about relentless promises to a suffering, worried, anxious people. The promise of a future of reconnection, of being gathered, of peace and of flourishing. But that future's not there yet. What's there now is chaos. The promise only comes when what is actually going on is exposed. The promise only gets named in the very same moment people are feeling what it actually is. And you know who knows and feels this more than anybody in Jeremiah? Rachel. Because Rachel is refusing to be consoled. Rachel can't be fooled by theme parks because a future promise is no consolation for a mother who has lost her children now. And here's the heart part of how this text might help us be claimed and tell our own stories. What does it mean to be a community of prophecy in a nation in long-standing racial crisis, full of vicious anti-Black and anti-brown violence, and a nation now in truly frightening political turmoil and instability that comes deeply and directly out of that same racial crisis? It means we recommit to justice, and we recognize there sits here a promise for our future, but only through lament. It means we've got to see Rachel, and we need to join her and make her lament our own, because she can't be fooled by theme parks. So I want to share another story. Last fall, some students at Drake organized a protest the week that Terrence Crutcher and Keith Scott were killed. So I invited my kids to come with me, and they said, well, can we make signs? And I said, sure, and they descended to the basement to make their signs. So you also need to know that my sister and her family live in Des Moines. My sister Janae is white, and my sister-in-law Toby, her partner, is Black, and their children, Amari and Travis, are Black, and our families are very close. So my kids participated in the protest, and it was very powerful for them because they were physically with Black and Latino people and other people of color and a few white people who stood there for 45 minutes together to say, no, we will not be consoled. And my kids observed young people being brave and loud about the value of their own lives and adults responding to and affirming them for making their 5- and 7-year-old voices heard, all very important. But the part of the story I want to share with you this morning had to do with their signs. Before the protest, when I went to the basement to get them and say, it's time to go, I walked in and my heart nearly stopped and I caught my breath. And I beheld Harper's gorgeous, colorful sign. And this is what it said. Black Lives Matter, M-A-T-E-R. They matter, M-A-T-E-R, the same as white. Stop killing them. And then at the bottom of her sign, my 7-year-old had written, people that are Black are Travis, Amari, Toby. Now let me be really clear. This is a very hard story. But I'm telling this story to try and enable a description and a feeling about what it might mean to make Rachel's lament our own. Because my child in her own 7-year-old way was lamenting that day because she's put the pieces together about who her beloveds are and what the stakes are in this fight. And she will not be consoled. And did my heart break when I saw that sign? Yes, it did. And that's the point. It's still broken, and I will not be consoled. But even as I wept that day, I also felt the promise of a future in the midst of lament, because my child's lament means she has not yet lost part of her humanity. She still knows something about what paradise looks like. Our refusal to be consoled is our hope to avoid making peace with a theme park when we are still in search of paradise. So what does it mean to be a community of prophecy? It means we don't take our eyes off Rachel. And we join her and refuse to be consoled. So one last thing about inconsolable people. Inconsolable people are not passive people. I guarantee you, when Rachel the prophet heard God say, "Your children are coming back, stop weeping," she was like, "What?" I am certain, as a parent, she didn't stop. She took her bitterly weeping, lamenting, still inconsolable self and continued to do everything in her power to mobilize all of her resources, her intellect, her connections, and to make it so. Inconsolable people are active. Inconsolable people do not succumb to the immobility of despair, even as we honor how we actually feel and how things actually are. Inconsolable is not the same as hysterical. Being inconsolable means you are singularly fixated on how wrong things are and are relentlessly obsessed with setting it right. And so you do have your wits about you. Inconsolable people are angry, and ours is a righteous anger about the moral arc of the universe that King says bends towards justice, being bent in ways so wrong that we will not be quiet or sit still until we set it right. Inconsolable people might be afraid, but our fear does not hold a candle to our resilience. We are loud. We make our lament known everywhere, every day, and every time we do so, we call others in to join us in being consolable and to name the reality that things are not right. Inconsolable people need other inconsolable people. That's how yellow becomes 2, and orange becomes 3, and green becomes 4, and on and on and on. Our kids often know this. Elisa Chavez, the prophet, is inconsolable. I don't know if I'm alive right now. I haven't heard my heartbeat in days. But she's not passive. Could have swung either way on the race war, but now I'm definitely spending the next 4 years converting your daughters to lesbianism. She's fixated singularly. We know everything we do is so the kids after us will be able to follow something towards safety. What can I call us but lighthouse? Martin Luther King Jr., the prophet, was inconsolable. We must force this nation's citizens to confront the ugliness of their prejudice and the tragedy of their racism. And he was angry. The white liberal, any of those in this room? The white liberal must escalate her support for racial justice. And he was resilient. The need for commitment is greater today than ever. So friends, in some ways, everything changed on November 8th. But in truthful, truth-filled, and truth-telling ways, in some things, nothing changed. Amen. The movement we honor today faced down the same violence of racism and hatred that brought us this presidential moment. And the work required of us as white liberals was no different. And the urgency of us getting serious about that work was no less on November 3rd than it became on November 8th. And the movement for Black Lives, which is today where Rachel lives, was already naming the death culture and offering a promise of a future if, as powerfully on November 3rd as it continues to do after November 8th. So friends, we today are afraid and we are uncertain, and we are angry, and we regret, and we are suspicious, and we are. But what we are not is alone, or without resources, or incredible models. Rachel, Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Septima Clark, so many, and today, Alicia Chavez, John Lewis, Alicia Garza, Patricia Colliers, Opal Tometi, and so many. And so for all the things we are, let us mostly join these prophets and be inconsolable with them and make Rachel's refusal our own. Because if we do, we will continue to know the difference, and we will refuse the allure of theme parks, and we will not rest until we find paradise. Amen.